Okay, I want to talk about COVID and all that stuff, but I'd like to start by talking about quarantine. Quarantine means when you're staying home because you don't want to catch COVID-19. I have been in quarantine, and I'm going to tell you all about it because it's also an introduction to my talk. I like quarantine. I don't know about you, but I could live like this forever. This is great. I am home alone with my girlfriend, and we've only been married for 55 years. So it's still very exciting, okay? And what do you do at home? I've been doing all the things you're supposed to do. I've been very well behaved. I've been practicing the piano, not just playing. That's really different for me. I haven't practiced in a long time. I've been exercising every day a little bit. I've been doing my work and, writing articles and writing things and all that. But I've also been working on languages. I've been trying out all the stuff that we did in our research. And, that is just wonderful when you can do that. I finally have the luxury and the time to do it. I work with a number of languages. It's really fun to do languages, to try. Okay, Dr. Ashtari is a fan of this too. She likes to do this too. So we have that in common. Some languages I'm really good at. Some languages I'm not so good. It's kind of in the middle, kind of, we say in Mandarin, mama hoo hoo, kind of in the middle. And some I'm really terrible in, really awful. And I think I know why. I'm working on one of my mediocre languages, one of my mama hoo hoo languages, and that's Spanish. I have lots of books at home in Spanish, and I've been reading them. Dr. Benico Mason, our colleague, recommends that when you're kind of low intermediate, read lots and lots of easy books, what we call graded readers, books written for people acquiring the language. So I've been reading these books. I'll tell you what I've been doing. I found a couple of really good authors where they're not just books for beginners to practice language. They've made them pretty interesting. One of my favorite authors is a very well-known scholar in language acquisition. His name is Bill Van Patten. And I didn't know that he wrote this stuff. I discovered it and I started reading it. He writes in Spanish, he writes in English, and in Spanish, he writes books for language acquirers, for students. And they're really good. I told him how good his books were, so he sent me some free ones, which was the whole idea, right? So this is wonderful. Let me tell you how good his books are. He makes them autobiographical. They're about him, I could tell. Now, Bill Van Patten is a very interesting, brilliant man, a very nice guy. He's very honest about himself. He is homosexual, he's gay, and he talks about it a lot in the stories. One story was very moving. It was about his relation, he changed the names, of course, a relationship between him and his sister. He and his sister they still are very, very close. His sister told the parents that Bill was gay. That's what the story's about. This great thing she did for her brother. That's the kind of stuff now. So it's getting better and better. Anyway, I think I'm getting better in Spanish. I'm only reading, I'm not speaking Spanish to anybody. I'm home. Who would I talk to? But I take a test once a week. I take a test at Ralph's supermarket. Every Friday, shopping is limited Friday morning early, only old people like me. So that's fun. There aren't a lot of people there. So I get my groceries. The first time I did it, I went to the checkout line and there was this guy. His name is Fidel. I could tell he was from Mexico. And I spoke Spanish to him. He, of course, answered me in English. That's what they do to be polite. So I responded in Spanish. I'll tell you what I said first in English, then I'll show off. I said, my goal is to speak Spanish as well as you do. Mi meta es hablar español como ustedes, like all of you. And he really liked that. I can help you. And I said, tú puedes ayudarme. I said, you can help me. Since that time, he's been speaking Spanish to me once a week for maybe a minute or two. That's all. But I can tell he's speaking more quickly. He's using more complicated grammar and vocabulary. We're beginning to make jokes. You know, I told him last time, those of you who speak Spanish, I said, soy muy feliz que estoy aquí. Tu español es mucho mejor, es casi perfecto. Your Spanish is really getting good, thanks to me, okay? So we joke around. He can feel, he can hear that I'm getting better. So his language is getting more complicated. Well, let me talk about staying home. I have a quote on the sheet here from Denzel Washington. I have really learned in the last few years to appreciate actors. They're not just people who say their lines. Because they're actors, they're quite insightful about the world. And Denzel Washington is one of the really smart ones. He posted something on Twitter, which I loved. He said, if anyone feels they wasted the time during quarantine because they didn't write a book or learn a second language or get their bodies in shape, I have good news. Quarantine ain't over. Get back inside. They're now saying this could last another year, probably longer. I'm going to get really good in Spanish, let me tell you. I'm looking forward to this and get fit and all this stuff. Well, if we look at the article, this is what this man, Brian Soika, wrote. We had a conversation, and actually he did a pretty good job. Usually you're horrified to see what people write, but he did okay. And in the end of the first paragraph, my notes correspond to the article. Number one is number one. He says, Kashin says, what we call comprehensible input, the ability to produce language is the result of getting the right kind of input. I'm so glad he said that. That's what we have found, the right kind of input, not just comprehensible. You can get that. I go to Subways a lot, okay? I like to go to high-class restaurants. So I go to Subway, and I speak Spanish to the people there, and it's the same stuff over and over again. We make the same jokes over and over again, and then I leave. I'm not getting new input, like I'm getting from Friedel and I'm getting from reading. So just having comprehensible input is not quite enough. Working with my colleague, Beniko Mason, I'll tell you more about her. The hypothesis now is that optimal input, the best input, has 4 characteristics, and they're on your sheet. Let me tell you about them. Of course, it's comprehensible. That doesn't mean you understand every single word. You can have a little bit of noise. Nobody understands every word, so don't worry about that. But you get the idea, okay? Not only is it comprehensible, but it's interesting. We want to make sure students pay attention to what we say. The best way of saying this is the input should be interesting. I now think interesting may not be enough. We want it to be very interesting. Compelling means so interesting that you forget that it's in another language. How often does that happen in language class? Probably never. We're going to change that. We want input to be fascinating, interesting, okay? Also, we want input to be rich. Lots of interesting vocabulary, lots of interesting messages. This helps a lot. We want the input, the words you use when you're, say, listening to a story, we want the words to push the story along, give you a deeper sense of the characters, give you a deeper sense of where they live, who they are, and it gives you more context. Context helps make the input comprehensible, and that's how we acquire. Finally, we want input to be abundant. That means a lot of it. Here's the news. Interesting stuff from the University of Illinois. That's where I went to undergraduate school. Oh gosh, several hundred years ago, it seems. Anyway, the University of Illinois professors have come up with some new stuff. Richard Anderson is the lead researcher. I really admire his work. He has discovered for first language acquisition, each time you hear a new word or you see a new word in print and you can kind of understand it, you acquire a little bit of it. Maybe 5%, maybe 10%. That's all. So you have to see it and hear it again, again, and again. That doesn't mean repeat the same sentence again, like in language classes. It means in different contexts. So it may take 10, 20 times. That's why the input needs to be abundant. Well, that's how we acquire language. Now let me ask the big question. What about grammar? What about grammar study? I have a confession to make for you. I have been accused of being against grammar. Don't teach grammar, it's bad for you. That's not quite right. But I've been accused of being an enemy of grammar. I love grammar. I love grammar. I can't help it. I'll never recover from this. In graduate school, my graduate education was all Chomsky. That's all we did was read Chomsky. I thought it was fantastic, amazing. But that's not how you teach language. We don't teach language through grammar. It may be interesting, it may be fun, but that's not it. In fact, my position now is that grammar teaching has limited value, not zero, but limited. If you want to, let's say you're speaking another language, think of a language that you speak kind of, okay, you're kind of intermediate, okay? It's not your first language, it's not English, some other language you had in school. When you're speaking, for me, it's Spanish. I like to think Spanish is very helpful to me. When I'm speaking Spanish, what I can do is when I'm about to say something, I can kind of inspect the language, inspect the sentence in my mind's eye, think of what I've got wrong, and apply a rule and correct what I'm going to say. If you do that, that's hard. I'll tell you what you have to do if you want to be successful. Number one, you have to know the rule. We don't know all the rules. Noam Chomsky doesn't know all the rules. Noam Chomsky knows more about English than anyone alive. He knows more about English than anyone who has ever lived. And he will tell you, we've only described fragments of English grammar. And if Chomsky doesn't know all the rules, what about the people who write grammar books? They know fewer rules. What about grammar teachers? What about our best students? We know, even the best students know only a tiny, tiny percentage of the rules of language. Okay, that's number one. If you want to apply grammar while you're speaking, you've got to think about grammar. You've got to think about being correct. That's hard to do. We have all made this mistake. We've tried to think about grammar while we're having a conversation. That's really tough. It's not a good idea. You construct your next sentence and you make everything agree, but the other person is still talking and you're not listening. So your sentence doesn't make sense anymore. I've done that over and over again. I finally learned not to do that, okay? Also, if you want to apply grammar rules during conversation, you have to have time. Conversation doesn't give you enough time. Those are the conditions. You have to know the rule, you have to be thinking about correctness, and you have to have time. Now, when in our lives are these conditions met? Only in one condition, when we give people a grammar test. When you give students a grammar test, they've studied the rules, so they know the ones you're going to test them on. They're thinking about correctness, because it's a grammar test, and they have time to write their answers. Our research, years and years ago, we found even if you give them a grammar test, they don't use that much grammar. It's very, very hard to do. So what are we going to do? How do we teach language? Let me tell you what I think is the answer. Let me give you the big concept first, the concept that has changed my life, and I hope will change your life, make your life easier, and a lot more fun. You know the answer? Stories. Stories are the answer. Stories in beginning, stories in intermediate language classes, sometimes called fiction. Let me tell you when I discovered stories. I finally realized I live about 30 miles from the city, from Santa Monica. And I like going to Santa Monica. I used to drive there twice a week, maybe longer, because there are two things that pull me to Santa Monica. One, of course, is my adorable grandchildren. I like to go see them and play with them. My grandson is only 17 now. Isn't that amazing? And I like to go, as you can tell, pumping iron. I like to go see my friend Arnold Schwarzenegger at Gold's Gym. Actually, I saw him once. I said hello. So I go there and I go on Pacific Coast Highway, and it can get really boring. I'm tired of listening to the Donald Trump news. That's all they have. And music, I don't understand the new music. I'm such an old person. I like the 1950s, the 1940s. So I don't do that very much. I started listening to stories, audiobooks, at first CDs, which I took out from the Santa Monica Public Library. Okay, they have a nice collection. And if you're driving and you're listening to stories, you don't want to listen to anything heavy. You want it just to be pleasant stories because you have to focus on driving, okay? So I wanted to get them in foreign languages, but they don't have those yet. Okay. So I've been doing bestsellers. I started with the best one, Harry Potter. Have you guys read Harry Potter? Oh, Camila's read Harry Potter, then you know all about it. The best thing about Harry Potter is the relationship among the students. Harry and his friends. That is so good. Their relationship, how they get along, the Weasley family, the whole thing. Second best thing, one of the heroes of Harry Potter is Dumbledore, who's the headmaster. A school principal is one of the heroes of these stories. As an educator, I just love that. We really appreciate what Dumbledore does, how he helps his students, etc. Harry Potter was so good that when I'm driving and I have to stop at some place to pick up something at the store, I pull into the parking lot and I sit in the car and wait to hear the end of the chapter. It is so good. After that, more young people's fiction, Hunger Games. Wow. Hunger Games is all about education. Hunger Games, the cities are competing against each other to get the money and the prizes. That's education. The federal government makes the school systems compete against each other for grants and funding. And we're always being compared. You know, did California beat Arizona? And, you know, your teachers are terrible because you didn't do well on the big test. So I think that was quite remarkable. Anyway, I found out these are very good writers. And then I started getting into adult bestsellers. I listened to mysteries, detective stories, stories about law. John Grisham. I have no interest in being a lawyer, the law, nothing. The stories are wonderful. They're so beautifully done. So I now understand how good these authors are. I should have known. Because I work in language acquisition, I've gone to lots of conferences, and very often the guest speakers are children's authors. Every one of them gives fascinating speeches. They are absolutely brilliant, brilliant people. Daniel Pinkwater is a personal friend of mine. Okay, that's another long story. Anyway, I think they're absolutely wonderful. Fiction is what counts. Let me tell you a little bit of what we know about fiction. I'll start with books, and then I'll work back through stories and how we do it in school. The research supports the idea that the best kind of reading you can do if you're a student of language is pleasure reading, books that you select yourself. Self-selected fiction. So different from school. Remember in school, they assigned books to you? I can't do that. When someone recommends a fiction book to me, a novel, I never read it. Um, One of the great authors, humorist Garrison Keillor, says, people know that I was an English literature major in college, like Dr. Ashtari and like my wife, okay? Very interesting people. He says, because I was a literature major in college, people are always giving me classics as gifts. So I have early plays of Shakespeare, novels by the Bronte sisters, and I have them on a shelf in my house. And I walk by the shelf and I feel the books staring down at me, making me feel guilty because I haven't read one of them. We don't like doing this. I'll give you two exceptions to this. I do accept recommendations for fiction from one person because I trust his judgment so completely. This person knows me better than I know myself. He knows what I would like to read, and he knows what I should read, okay? And that's my son. He's now a professor of mathematics. Can you believe that? Kurt Vonnegut says, children succeed where their parents fail. How about that? Anyway, and my idea of not accepting gift books only works for fiction. Nonfiction is something else because my colleagues recommend things that are important. I see what they've done, I read them, etc. Here's a new thing, and that's very important. That's the intellectual flow of knowledge. Dr. Ashtari and I have a steady back and forth along with our friends of what's good, what we should read, and it's just about always correct. In fact, it has been so far. So self-selected reading is really what's important. Here is our big research result. The self-selected, light, easy pleasure reading of fiction is the source of our vocabulary, the source of our spelling, the source of our writing style. That's where it comes from. It doesn't come from spelling lists and spelling words and spelling tests. It comes from this reading. Amazing. Now, I will not say if you're a reader, you must be a perfect speller. No, but you'll be much better than someone who hasn't read. And I don't think anybody's a perfect speller anyway. So reading is responsible for our language. And the reading is a gift that keeps giving. There's more to it, much more. People who read more know more. They know more about nearly everything. They know more, of course, they know more about literature. They know more about history, politics. They know more about science. Now, you know I'm talking about Donald Trump now. You can tell I'm getting there, okay? They know more about science. They know more about practical matters. You get this from reading fiction. I'm going to pause here and tell you about my cousin Evelyn, one of my favorite stories. My cousin Evelyn was my mother's best friend, let me tell you, when mom was alive. They had this perfect aunt-niece relationship, and she lived fairly close to us back in the Midwest. Evelyn is now 93 years old. She's my older cousin. And when I was a little boy, she was wonderful. She's still wonderful. I would go see her and her husband, Marty, who passed away, who's also wonderful. And I would play the piano and she would play the violin. And we'd have great discussions. The other day, I was talking to Evelyn, actually, it's about 2 months ago. I was talking to Evelyn. And she said, Stephen, I want to find out more about the law. Now, her late husband, Marty, had a degree in law. He never practiced law, but he knew a lot about it. And she said that was so valuable, so important to get through life knowing about the law. She said, I am going to take a class in the legal system and legal terminology. And I gave her some good advice, I think. I said, Evelyn, why don't you try reading books by John Grisham? Read novels, read The Firm, read The Runaway Jury. She said, okay, where do I get them? I said, I'll send them to you. I have been buying her books. I've been ordering her legal books for the last couple of months. I send them to her. And because I'm discussing this with you now, it is legal for me to deduct this from my taxes. So it's not that expensive anymore. Evelyn loves it. She said, I am learning so much about the law without trying because it's fiction and the stories are excellent. This is a good example. This is where we get our knowledge of the world. There's more. Reading gives you even more. Very exciting. I found an article about 5 years ago in Scientific American about reading fiction and developing good habits of the mind. They reported, and since then I've read all the research, fascinating, that when you read novels, you develop a better sense of other people. You become more empathic. You have more empathy. You understand other people more. I'll give you some quotes that reflect this. This is from Terry Gross, who's a radio person here in Los Angeles. When you're reading fiction, what you learn is empathy. You're learning to be somebody else, learning to see the world through their eyes. When you read fiction, you become the main character. You are the protagonist. You go through the same adventures, solve the same problems, meet the same people, and you can see, he tells you, she tells you how she's thinking. You get a deep, deep insight. Also, when you read fiction, you learn to be suspicious of simple solutions. You know the world is complicated, especially if you read detective stories. Oh my gosh, problem solving, etc. I finally got around to reading Murder on the Orient Express. Talk about complexity. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and understanding how other person think. Now, the President Obama was interviewed by a British newspaper. And it's as if he had read all this research, okay? And he said the same thing. They asked him, do you read fiction? And he said, I think, when I think about how I understand my role as a citizen or president, the most important understandings, the most important stuff I've learned from novels. This is Barack Obama, okay? It has to do with empathy. It has to do with being comfortable with the notion the world is complicated and full of grays, but there's still truth there to be found. You have to strive for that and work for that. And the notion that it's possible to connect with someone else, even though they're very different from you. Exactly what you get from novels. So I've become a big fan of fiction. That's the syllabus. Let me tell you what Chomsky said, and then we'll talk about Donald Trump. How's that? They're debating tonight. I think, they're going to make his microphone silent. I think they should do that forever, 100% all the time. Anyway, Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, it's quite possible, overwhelmingly probable, that we will always learn more about human life and personality than from novels, rather than scientific psychology. Isn't that amazing? I think this is absolutely true. Well, I want to show off and brag a little bit. I wrote a letter to the editor about this. And it got published. The Washington Post, this was in 2018, or more than a couple of years ago. The Washington Post published a number of letters to the editor commenting on the President of the United States, Donald Trump, about his spelling. The Post had pointed out that in his tweets, Trump makes lots of spelling mistakes. And people were writing in saying, no, you shouldn't make those mistakes. And then some people started writing in and were defending Trump. They say, we elected him as commander-in-chief, not speller-in-chief. All he needs is a proofreader to correct his mistakes. Don't make a big deal. Don't pick on him, okay? It's not fair. Then I wrote a letter. Mr. Trump's spelling mistakes reflect problems deeper than a failure to proofread. My research shows poor spelling is often the result of not having a reading habit. Studies show that those who read a lot know more Okay, so poor spelling is another result of not having a reading habit. Studies also show those who read more know a lot more about history and science. They also have greater empathy with others, and they understand the world is complex. Mr. Trump is a perfect example of a non-reader. Before I give you detail on that, let me tell you why I was encouraged to write the letter. I read a quote by former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Brilliant man. He was president 100 years ago, or a little more. He said, "It is the obligation of the citizen to criticize the president. If you think the president is wrong, if you don't criticize the president, you are not a good citizen. In fact, he says that is treasonous." So I'm simply being a patriotic citizen of the United States by writing this letter. Trump, as we know, does make incredible number of spelling mistakes. His writing style isn't very good. He doesn't know much about history. He doesn't know much about geography. Look what he's been saying about COVID-19, these cures. People are going to die from drinking this awful stuff. He is really dangerous. He's not doing the right thing to control the virus. He's responsible for the death of thousands of people for not wearing a mask. So he doesn't know science. He doesn't know about history and geography. When he was in Israel, he was about to leave, get on the plane, and he said to his hosts, "I'm now on my way to the Middle East." Well, that's where you are now. Okay, that's the kind of mistakes he makes. It's just the simplest facts that any sixth grader would know. And I think we are all suffering because of Mr. Trump. Okay, now that I've destroyed Donald Trump, let me go back and talk about pedagogy, all right? Oh my, what should we do about this? I'm going to give you a model developed by Beniko Mason, which I think is very good. And here's what she recommends. The first stage, today, in fact, the first stage of nearly all beginning second language programs is stories. Have you noticed that? They all started to tell stories. Dr. Mason's program does that too. She calls it story listening. Her students, she was teaching, she just retired, she was teaching at a university in Japan. And she did classes in psycholinguistics and all that, but she also taught EFL, English as a Foreign Language. Very good experience. The beginning level was stories. Stories that she selected of universal interest that everybody she thought would like. She took a lot of them from Grimm's fairy tales and fairy tales of other cultures, etc. She would read the story beforehand, prepare a list of words and expressions that the students might have problems with. And she would prepare ways of making them comprehensible. Her favorite way, draw a picture. She's a good artist. Explain what the word means with other words. Since she speaks Japanese and her students were Japanese, she might give a quick translation in Japanese. The idea was not for the students to master the vocabulary. They didn't study it later. They simply tried to understand the story. She found, and here's a remarkable result, you get more vocabulary per minute by listening to stories than doing vocabulary exercises. You don't follow the story with drills and exercises, draw a line from the word to the definition, write 3 sentences with each story, with each word. No, you listen to another story, more stories. The frequent words will come back because they are frequent. Don't worry. If they don't come back, you don't need them. It's as simple as that. The goal of the story listening, and it could take quite a while, it could take 2 semesters, okay? They hear hundreds of stories that they like, that they enjoy. She knows from her experience which ones work. The goal is to bring you to the point where you start to read. The first thing you read is the written version of the stories. The goal is self-selected pleasure reading. She has another stage that helps you get there, which I think is very important. She calls it guided self-selected reading. In guided self-selected reading, the students read extremely easy texts, very easy, what we call graded readers. And you know the Newbery series, the Longman series, you've had those in class, you've used them as a teacher, etc. And the students read not one, not two, they read hundreds. Can you imagine how easy and comfortable this is? It's wonderful. That's what I did with Spanish. I was trying out her system. I have read real Spanish. Last summer, I read Zorro by Isabella Allende. It was a little hard for me, I'll tell you, but it was so good. Oh my gosh, she is wonderful. She's so good that you can't wait to turn the page to see what's going to be in the next chapter. So that was good, but still a little bit tough. So I happily went to graded readers, and I found myself gradually, slowly, effortlessly getting better because the books were very enjoyable. Okay. So that's what the students do. You remember your language class in school. I took French in high school. Oh boy. Each lesson, there would be a list of vocabulary words and grammar you're supposed to learn. And the story was designed to help you learn the new grammar and vocabulary. So it was always very, very boring. Okay. We don't do this now. We have interesting stories, etc. The goal, after a year or so of this, lots of stories, the students can then start reading on their own with novels that they select. Actually, this guided reading part could last longer. Once you get into these easy graded readers, you could read 100, 200, even 300. Her library at the university, they have 5,000 graded readers. Isn't that wonderful? The students can then self-select. The teachers help them find the right books, but by the time they finish, after 2, 3 semesters, 4 semesters, they're ready to start reading what we call authentic books. When we reach that part, our job is done. Our job is to make students independent, to bring them to the point where they can read on their own. I want to show you just a touch of the research of this kind to show how much free reading, self-selected reading gives you. I'll start with the study that Benico stimulated. As I told you, she teaches this class in English as a foreign language along with the academic stuff. And her classwork is stories. The homework is reading graded readers. Isn't that nice? And the students really like it. And every semester, every year, some of the students have said, we'd like to continue doing this on our own. Would you kind of help us? Would you sort of guide us through? She said, sure, but do me a favor. Take alternate forms of a test. The TOEIC test. You guys know the TOEIC test. The TOEIC test, I call it TOEIC fever. TOEICs are everywhere in Taiwan, in Japan, in Korea. Oh my gosh, people are TOEIC crazy. There's this one guy, I got to tell you, in Japan. He takes the TOEIC every year. He gets 100% and he gets his name in the paper. Oh, he needs to find a life. Let me tell you, something else to do with his time. Anyway, the TOEIC is so important that employers require a certain level of TOEIC before they give you a job, and you have to improve a certain level to keep your job, et cetera. So Asia has TOEIC fever, that's for sure. So here's what we found. Some of the students read for semester 2, some of them read for 2 years on their own. They kept track of how many books, of what the books were that they read, and they kept track of their TOEIC scores, which they took every few months. Here are the results. This is so spectacular. Maybe you should all sit down because you'll be so shocked. For every hour you read, you gain at least a half a point on the TOEIC. A very steady result with surprisingly little variation. Now the TOEIC goes from like 0 to 1,000, and 250 means you're ready to start reading. So these kids went, if they read like 2-3 hours a day, they could go up like 300 points. They do it for a couple of years. They could do the whole thing. They could go from 250 all the way through 850, 900, 950. You rather do that, reading books you like, or would you rather do drills and exercises, which don't work very well and are very, very boring? What they read was different. Students read different things. It was self-selected. One student, male, read nearly entirely romance novels. I'd like to meet him. He seems interesting. Self-confidence, etc. That's good. Another one read more graded readers. Another read detective story. It was different. The results were surprisingly similar. This stuff really, really works. Another study. This was done at the University of London. The University of London has had a research team that has been looking at the same people for 40 years. They started when they were babies, giving them tests every few years and comparing. I wonder if it's the same researchers. Probably getting pretty old by now. Okay, anyway, the last time they did it, these are native speakers of English, London, living in London. They gave them a vocabulary test and questionnaires. They had done that before. They found what were you reading, etc. The best predictor of scores on the vocabulary test, pleasure reading. And the kind of reading that was the most powerful, fiction. In fact, middle-brow fiction, intermediate fiction, was a better predictor than nonfiction. And it didn't matter how much reading they did when they were little kids. It only mattered how much reading they were doing now. They were in their 40s. When I get to be 40, I'm going to start reading. I know what's going on now. Okay. One more study, and then we'll go on to some related topics. This was, let me find my notes here. I keep bringing the wrong notes. I keep bringing my lecture on getting rich through real estate. That's the wrong one. Okay. One more study. Okay. Let me find it.
Can we have that one too? Because I think we all want to get rich through real
Oh, I'll
estate.
tell you how to do that. That's easy.
Thank you.
I figured out the secret of getting rich through real estate. I watched a bunch of these lectures, and the third one, I figured out how they did it, and it does work. The way to get rich through real estate is to give lectures on getting rich through real estate and make money that way, okay? Okay. All right, so we'll leave that one. I also talk about here, not just the value of fiction, but I also talk about heritage language a little bit. Let's talk about that. Heritage language, all of you are familiar with this concept of heritage language, okay? Most of you in class who have children do not grow up speaking English. They grow up speaking your language, the home language. That's called a heritage language. We have looked at the research on heritage language, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, etc. It used to be considered bad. Oh, you're preventing the children from acquiring English. We had this whole movement against bilingualism in the United States. Fortunately, that's gone. But we now know from the research that there are no disadvantages to bilingualism, no disadvantages for your children to keep their language and improve it. Only advantages. I'll tell you what the advantages are. Number one, career advantages. Of course, being bilingual gives you better job opportunities. The easy way of saying this, and this has been confirmed by Joshua Fishman's research, if you want to buy, you can do it in English anywhere in the world. But if you want to sell, it's good to know your customer's language. So it has the United States has better trade with countries where we have people who know the language than people who don't. So this is extremely important. We also know bilinguals do better in school. I want to say bilinguals are smarter. I'm not quite sure it's true, but they do better in school. They do slightly better than non-bilinguals with similar backgrounds who don't keep the home language. I'm sure it's not true of everybody. I know several bilinguals who are not very smart at all, but overall, it's generally true. So bilinguals also have a richer sense of multiculturalism. They learn to value and respect their home culture and the culture they're living in, which is really pleasant. They can also take advantage of the wisdom of the family. They can talk to their uncles. They can talk to their grandparents. We must make an effort to do this. In the United States, with Spanish-speaking children, the children, when they come to first grade, generally speak Spanish okay from home. They're fluent, they're comfortable. By the time they're in middle school, junior high school, their English is already better. And they have problems talking to their nietos, to their grandparents. That is the problem. And they miss out on all these advantages. How do we do this? How do we keep the heritage language? Well, there's one main method. After they've gotten what they can from mommy and daddy, they can take classes. We call these heritage language classes. We now know from Dr. Ashtari's research, from your professor's research, this has not been a big success. She's interviewed people who've been in these classes, and they tell you things like, I hated it. I could have been outside playing with the other kids. And we were doing these boring things in class. Traditional instruction is not working. It's not working in Farsi, which Dr. Ashtari has looked at. It's not working in Spanish. It's not working anywhere. The easy way, stories, reading for pleasure. So if we get children reading for pleasure and we get them excited, what are they going to read? Even in Spanish, the books aren't there. Another former student of mine, Sandra Pucci, did a study of a school in Los Angeles that was 90% children from Spanish-speaking families. She looked in the school library. By the time the children were in 4th and 5th grade, there was nothing for them to read in the school library. I go to public libraries. I'm always looking for good books in Spanish. Usually it's classics translated, things like that, or very difficult philosophical books, etc. Nothing for the child that's really, really interesting. This is so easy to take care of. That's Spanish, this big popular language. In Farsi, it's much, much worse. One of the interesting studies that Dr. Ashtari did is on the handout here. She went into a library and took books. This is in a library in an area where there are lots of Iranian families, and found books on the shelf. The only ones there were pedagogical books, how to improve your Farsi, a review of Farsi grammar. And she used a technique borrowed from a friend of ours, a guy named Jeff McQuillan. We have great admiration for. Jeff McQuillan did this. He wrote an article called Who Uses the Berlitz Tapes, okay, after they order them. He looked at all the self-help books in his local library and looked to see where the pages were creased, where they were worn, where there were thumb marks, and they were folded or whatever. And you could tell how far the kids get in the books or the readers. Average, about 16% of the pages were read. Farsi, much worse, 5%. They're not reading the books. The books are not there. The first thing we want to do, we also know from research that if you read more, you're better. And it works if you read in Japanese, if you read in Korean, and if you read in Chinese, we get the same results. We're doing everything but doing it right. For a tiny investment, we think nothing of spending millions of dollars on useless computers that are obsolete in 2 years, and we're not willing simply to get more books. Well, I have one more final sermon to give. Hope you don't mind. The last point, and this is good news for you, because this is going to make your life a little easier, I hope. This is designed to save you money, okay? People complain. My arrogant colleagues at the university complain. Teachers don't read. They're not intellectual like us. They don't read the journals. They don't read the research. They don't need my books, papers, whatever. Of course they don't read. How could they read? Number one, as you know already, teachers are overwhelmed with work. They have no time to sit down. The articles about language teaching are nearly completely incomprehensible. They're hard for me. They're hard for Dr. Ashtari. We complain about this all the time. They're difficult. And they're too long. They're much too long. Someone says, if you ask someone the time, you don't want a history of the wristwatch. So they're long, they're boring, and they're expensive. I found this out in 2007. This is when this all started for me. I was invited to contribute a chapter to a book of readings. It was a book of readings about input. The title was very clever. It was called Input Matters. That's cute. You know, issues about input, and input's important. Okay. And I wrote an article for them. I was very flattered. Okay. They invited me. How nice. I wrote a long paper. It was the last long paper I've ever written. And it was a question of what we call self-indulgence. I gave in to temptation. I just wrote all the things I was interested in. I gave my theory, why I was right. I talked about research and literacy, first language, second language. I had a whole section on animal language. Does the theory of comprehensible input explain animal language? And I had a long footnote. What will happen when the aliens land from other planets? Flying saucers. How will we talk to them? I had a whole footnote on that, and I borrowed from Star Trek, their assumptions, etc. And alien abductions, people who claim they were stolen and put on flying saucers. I wrote down what they said. I had such a good time. I was so happy with the article. I realized I had this plan. When it works, I'm going to get 10 copies at author's discount and give them as gifts to my relatives, okay? Including my cousin Evelyn, of course. It finally came out. This is 2007. The retail cost in American dollars, $160 hardcover. The soft cover was over $80. I couldn't afford it. I got 2 free copies, that's all. I asked for 3, they said no, okay? 2, and one was soft cover, one was hardcover. Those are the only copies I have, all right? I'm getting revenge. I'm Xeroxing parts of it and giving it away. Okay, all right, I don't care anymore. Anyway, if you become a scholar and you're invited to put an article in a book like that, no one's going to read it because they can't afford it. Your article is doomed to oblivion. I've looked at Google Scholar and that article has not been cited very much because no one can afford the book. So I've decided no more. I've been inspired by some other scholars who have decided to rebel against the book publishers and the journal publishers. By the way, I don't subscribe to professional journals anymore. I think I subscribe to 2 of them because they're cheap. They're too expensive. If you want to read things in journals, you want to subscribe to the journal, $200 a year, $300, some are $1,000. If you want to just order the article, $40. The author doesn't get it. The publisher gets it. So here is the rebellion. And I am part of it. Yes. So is Dr. Ashtari. So is Jeff McQuillan. So is Benico Mason. Yes. We'll all be in jail together. We now only publish in what are called open access journals. These are journals that will accept your paper. You pay nothing. The reader pays nothing. The journals are free. They're all on the internet. You can simply go there and look at the article. You can download the whole journal. They love it if you do. That's where we publish. We also post our articles on a website called ResearchGate. We've all done this. Go to ResearchGate, type in our names, you'll find our stuff. This is illegal, but it's wonderful. It deserves to exist. I also have a website, and you can go there, sdkrashen.com. My papers are there. You can download them for free. Don't ask my permission. You can give them away. You can give them to anybody except Donald Trump. He won't read it anyway. Okay. So that is the new thing. Books are now too expensive. Forget it. We are striking back. The book publishers, the journal publishers have to find a way of making money honestly. You should not have to go to the bookstore and spend $500 on textbooks. Okay, that is my presentation. It is now time for you to ask me burning questions. So if you have any questions, I should have given you more warnings so you could think of them. Now is the time. Let me see if I covered everything. Yeah, I think so. I think so.